So welcome to this session on translating the UN Guiding Principles. As we've heard over the course of yesterday, for those who attended the Safe Space sessions, as well as others who may have attended side events, and of course over the course of this morning's sessions as well, we've heard a lot about what the UNGPs are, what they're meant to do, and also the challenges and the opportunities when it comes to their adoption and implementation in this region. But one of the key issues that we have often heard, but not really investigated in great detail and examined how exactly we can overcome these barriers, is the question of translation. And I mean this in both a literal as well as figurative sense. Translation of the UNGPs into policy, into actual mandatory human rights due diligence or other legislation or measures, but it's also about translating the UNGPs so that it speaks to the local context, so that it speaks to intersectionality concerns, and also so that it speaks to the language that people use. And of course, already over the course of this forum, we have already been treated to the diversity of not just perspectives, but also backgrounds, including linguistic backgrounds that people hail from. So in light of this, I'm very privileged to be moderating this session, this roundtable, and to have on either side very esteemed colleagues who really do know their stuff as practitioners, but also as thought leaders. So I am going to proceed on the basis of alphabetical order in terms of how I introduce each of my fellow panelist speakers here. So if I can start with you, Manja. So on my far left is Mary Ann Manja Bayang, who is a very well-respected Indigenous lawyer who has over 2 decades of experience working on Indigenous people's rights, land rights, environment, women's rights, business and human rights, among others. On my right here is Pochoy Labog, who is the Southeast Asia researcher and representative for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. He is responsible for research on business-linked rights, abuses, and company outreach in the Southeast Asia region. And then on my left is someone who I don't really think needs introduction, given that she already treated us to a lot of insights earlier this morning, but Kunarilak Paichayapum from the Ministry of Justice of Thailand. She is currently the director of the International Human Rights Division of the Rights and Liberties Protection Department. She is also the team leader in drafting Thailand's National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights and in pushing forward NAP implementation and the business and human rights agenda in Thailand. And then last but not least, gives me pleasure to introduce Kelly Scott, who is an expert when it comes to international business and human rights issues. She works with BSR across a number of industries and has extensive experience working in the Asia Pacific region in particular. Prior to joining BSR, Kelly was focused on driving business respect and support for children's rights across a number of sectors, including the apparel and footwear and extractives at UNICEF UK. So again, this is only really a taster of the wealth of experience that our speakers will bring to the roundtable today. And so please join me in welcoming them, and I'll start them off with one question, but for now, please join me in welcoming them. All right, so I am mindful of the fact that this is not exactly a round table, it's a rather linear table, but I will take into consideration that we are in a rather round room nonetheless. To start us off with the first question, this is for all of the speakers, I'd really like to hear your thoughts on whether you think a common understanding or a common interpretation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights actually exists among the different stakeholders operating in this space. Does it exist? Can it exist? Should it exist? How about we start with you, Manja, and then we'll go alphabetically again. Thank you.
Thank you, Pichimon, and it's an honor to be speaking in front of you today. The language of the UNGP is quite simple and straightforward, in my opinion, and has been it has been overly emphasized. It does not create new obligations that are not already existing under international human rights law. Understanding and interpreting the UNGPs is not the problem. The big problems here are, number one, the lack of political willpower to implement the guiding principles on the part of the states. Number two, the lack of awareness of businesses about the UNGPs, and for those who are aware, the attitude to find ways to go around these regulations to protect profit over human rights. And third, the lack of awareness among civil society about the UNGPs. And in situations where civil society are aware, they face the shrinking space for democratic exercise of their human rights. States are fully aware that they have the obligation to protect human rights and fulfill them. Yet until now, for example, in Asia, there are 48 countries in Asia, but there are only 3 who adopted national action plans in the 10 years of implementation of the UNGP. Until now, we receive information almost every day about numerous human rights violations in many countries in the Asia Pacific. Indigenous peoples are being killed for defending their lands, territories, and resources. Human rights defenders are being criminalized and publicly vilified for their advocacies. Communities are being displaced from their homes to give way to business activities. Legislations on human securities are widely being used by states to go after human rights defenders and to suppress the exercise of fundamental freedoms. And to make matters worse, the environment of impunity permeates, and perpetrators of human rights are most often than not, they are not brought to justice. On the part of businesses, the level of awareness of businesses about their obligation to respect human rights is not really excellent. We meet agents of businesses working on the ground who have zero knowledge about the UNGPs and who are only focused on ticking the boxes in the list of government requirements for them to get business permits. In this situation, the obligation again falls back to the states to put in place stronger measures and policies to make businesses respect human rights. But then again, the problem is the lack of willpower of states to impose these stronger regulations. So it's not the lack of understanding or error in interpretation of UNGPs that we are facing, but the lack of political willpower of states to implement, the lack of awareness of UNGPs on the ground of different stakeholders, the increasing corporate abuses of human rights, and weak regulations to protect human rights, and the wide latitude of perpetrators to commit human rights violations without fear of accountability or persecution. I'll stop there.
Thank you for that, Manja. It's really intriguing how you've put it in terms of it's not a lack of understanding or an error of understanding, it's really the lack of awareness and willpower, rather. In your experience working in the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, Puchoy, what have your observations been, given that you work with a range of stakeholders in your role?
So yeah, in our work with the resource center, we can say, and I think most of us in the room can say, if there's a win that the UNGPs have garnered, it's really on the discursive level with businesses, states. The UNGPs have become the standard for business and human rights, and that's undeniable, and we see that more businesses are interested in the UNGPs. That being said, I agree with Manja. Of course, there's the problem with the UNGPs is really its nature. It's characteristic of being voluntary, and we need to progress from more voluntary mechanisms to a more mandatory mechanism to account for corporate linked violations. And also to add to that, we can say that in the consciousness of states and corporations, yes, the UNGPs are already, they have a common understanding, but we need to do a better job in bringing down the UNGPs on the community level, because community members or those that are impacted by industry at the community level, people's organizations are not very familiar with the UNGPs of international frameworks. Most of them are still battling their own struggles and focused on local legislation, actually, and the complexities of dealing with local administrative agencies and local laws, and so we need to do a better job in bringing these international frameworks to them. And I think that's a challenge that the working group can take, and also the UN and the civil society as we do our work on the ground.
Thank you for that, Pusha. And you're right in that it is incredibly important that we ensure that there is a clear understanding of what the UNGPs means to those who are on the ground floor. On the. See, I tried to be very efficient and keep time, and then of course I can't control my own phone. But nonetheless, that aside, it is very important that we ensure that people who are on the ground actually understand what the UNGPs stand for and that the UNGPs speak to their experiences. So Kunnarilak, I understand, of course, that it's not simple for governments either when it comes to translating and also communicating what frameworks like the UNGPs mean. You also made the point earlier today about the challenges in even communicating to small and medium enterprises, and that I believe sometimes for SMEs, human rights might seem like quite a daunting word. So in light of that, what have been your experiences in trying to communicate the UN guiding principles to stakeholders that you work with?
Thank you very much. For me, I think every stakeholder has a different level of knowledge and understanding on the UNGPs. Because from my experience, let me tell you the story. I mean, Ministry of Justice, we work on the UNGP. We start working on UNGP like about 5-6 years ago, and at that time, when Ministry of Justice was assigned to be the core agency, it was kind of new to Ministry of Justice as well, because we get used to work with the law enforcement officer and the like police, attorney general, something like this. So we have to work and make the state actor, like for example, Ministry of Commerce, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Natural Resource Environment, and the kind of Ministry of Industrial to understand the linkage between their work and also the human rights as well. So it is our duty. We have to study by ourselves as well. So we have to make ourselves clear and understanding about the UNGP principle at that time, and we need to explain to the line ministry as well. And in the past, my boss, my team bring our team to talk to the head, the top executive of each ministry that has duty to work under the NAP, to make sure that they understand the importance of the UNGP and the NAP, and also to make sure that they include the activity and implement the activity in the NAP. So that is one way that we try to make the top executive understand on the NAP, and we want to make sure that everyone has common understanding on the NAP. And apart from that, we also organize a lots of activities, a lots of media. We also develop several forms of media. We organize a lots of activity like meeting, conference, seminar, training on UNGP and the NAP. And also we develop several forms of media like infographic, podcast, brochure, exhibition, and soon to be developed is the e-learning on the business on the UNGP and the NAP as well, and also the just this year we together with the Global Compact Network of Thailand, National Human Rights Commission of Thailand, UNDP, and also the Security Exchange Commission of Thailand, we set up the Business and Human Rights Academy to be a knowledge hub for the all stakeholders to be the knowledge hub, and we hope that everyone can join the training from the academy, and it not only aim to be the knowledge hub for the country, but we hope this academy would be the knowledge hub for the region as well. And I think we work in several ways to make sure that they are understanding, and we were also invited by the civil society sector for the business to talk on the issue of UNGP as well. This is very important to make sure that everyone is understanding. And the new initiative this year is also actually just last month that we think that to translate UNGP or NAP into practice, it shouldn't be limited only in the central level. So we during the past 2 years we we identified 10 pilot provinces across the country, pairing between big city and small city, and find a model to implement the UNGP. And we found that we actually should set up kind of the committee at the provincial level, and to make sure that the NAP will be implemented at the local level as well, not only limited and not only limited in the central level. So from next year, we will set up the provincial committee to driving forward the UNGP and the NAP in every province across the country, shared by the provincial governor. So and comprised of relevant ministry at the local level, at each provincial level, and also the representative from the business, like Chamber of Commerce or Industrial Association or SME Federation at the local at each province as well. So I think this can be another good mechanism to make sure that everyone has common understanding on the UNGP.
Thank you for that. And I actually, there's a follow-up question in there when you use the term the local level, because I get the sense that even that term itself is going to be interpreted quite differently by the people on this panel, but roundtable. So maybe we'll come back to that. But before then, Kelly, would you be able to share your experiences in communicating with businesses? Is there a common understanding at all about the UNGPs?
Thank you, Pichiman. So the simple answer is no. There is no common understanding. Our role at BSR is to help to translate the guiding principles to our member companies, of which we have about 300 across a number of sectors. So in terms of communicating, what this actually means, we don't take local context for granted. We understand that it is very challenging to implement the guiding principles, but we've seen that companies who are, most likely multinationals, they have a better understanding of what the guiding principles actually mean in practice and how to implement them, I guess, in theory. But when we're working with companies in, say, for example, the Asia Pacific region, or doing other operations, we're seeing a disconnect between multinationals and their operations and their subsidiaries. So we're seeing a gap in communication, unfortunately, and I think that this could be strengthened. Obviously, we know that civil society rights holders, they have a better understanding of what the guiding principles mean. They have a better understanding of the concept of human rights. And I think the best way to bridge this gap is to focus on increased collaboration. There needs to be ongoing dialogue on what these potential and actual adverse impacts look like. What does it mean to promote human rights? There needs to be more active dialogue between all stakeholders so that we can bridge the gap in knowledge and understanding on what this means. Another thing is, we're seeing a gap in understanding, obviously among all stakeholders, but there is among our companies, there is this appetite to understand how they can implement them better. There is a maturity curve in terms of how they're implementing them. But there is a general willingness to understand, but also contextualize. And I noticed that you mentioned local context, and I think that context actually matters, because I think this has been an actual barrier to implementation, because the framework might seem quite general. How do you actually apply this to local context where you're taking, culture, language into consideration as well? So I think that looking at those considerations would absolutely help.
No, absolutely. And to be fair, I don't think we do enough in terms of the cultural space, even to ensure that dialogues are actually culturally sensitive, right? I remember being in meetings with colleagues from the Pacific Island countries who say that for them, it's the nature of the meetings, the dialogue, the process of communicating that perhaps matters even more than the ultimate outcome, because it's about trust building, it's about creating those relationships. So if I can kind of follow up on what each of you have said with a question about kind of appreciating those intersectional concerns, the culture, the economics, the politics, but also, of course, for Indigenous peoples, the fact that they are Indigenous peoples, for women, the fact that they are women. How is that, or to what extent has that informed your approach to communicating the UNGPs to your stakeholders? To what extent have you been able to factor in intersectionality concerns in the work that you do, in the dialogues or the work that you've published or communicated to your stakeholders? Maybe we'll go in the same order for this one again, and we'll start with you, Manja. I can elaborate on the question. I will say this: I am throwing my really lovely speakers here a bit of a curveball by giving them. Well, I mean, in essence, so to pick up on Poshoy's point, he says that Kelly's point about it being a lot about dialogue, right? But also in consultations with civil society, dialogue can mean different things to different people, and what constitutes a good dialogue, a productive dialogue, can look different. So I guess in one sense, how can we ensure that dialogues are indeed productive, that they indeed take into account those intersectional concerns about culture, race, ethnicity, gender, into how we communicate and talk about the UN guiding principles. And I wonder whether you might have any examples from your own work or what you've been able to observe as good practices in that regard.
It would be difficult to point out a good practice, considering that what we receive more are failure of states to comply with their obligations. But for Indigenous peoples, for a dialogue to be effective would be, especially in Asia, I think foremost, there should be a recognition of the existence of Indigenous peoples by states in their territories, in their jurisdictions. A lot of countries in Asia deny the identity of Indigenous peoples in their jurisdictions. And if we deny that they exist, that there are Indigenous populations in our countries, then effectively we're also denying all the rights of these Indigenous peoples. Another thing, especially in relation to development projects, extractive industries, and so on, is the failure to implement the principle of free, prior, and informed consent in relation to Indigenous peoples. A lot of consultations are being done with Indigenous peoples in relation to projects, but it is not in line with the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. Most are being done only to, as I said earlier, tick the box that there has been a conversation with Indigenous peoples. Free, prior, informed consent would demand that we respect the cultural and traditional decision-making processes of Indigenous peoples on the ground, that we converse, we enter into conversations with Indigenous peoples in a language that they understand, that we give them the independence and the respect of the right to self-determination to decide on their own, and that we avoid or we prevent any means of trying to manipulate community decisions, because these are the problems that we often meet on the ground in relation to the conduct of free, prior, and informed consent processes. So for Indigenous peoples, a meaningful dialogue would mean recognizing their existence, recognizing their rights, and ensuring that the free, prior, informed consent process is meaningfully implemented.
Thank you for that. Yes, Pochoy, please go ahead.
Yeah, to add to what Manja said, yes, dialogue is very important. In order to understand the affected communities, we have to really meet them in where they are and actually empower them to be part or organize these dialogues with them. That being said, of course, that's the ideal. This conversation of dialogue with businesses and states with the communities cannot be divorced from what's happening on the ground, politically and economically. In states in Southeast Asia, there's rampant demonization of human rights defenders. Dissent is seen as a terroristic act, and we cannot divorce that environment from this notion that we can have these dialogues, and that's just a reality that indigenous peoples are facing, and it would help, of course, and this is a huge challenge for civil society, to have a recognition not only of indigenous peoples' rights and their territories, but also recognition of human rights defenders. There, it's very challenging to name companies that have this perspective. There's actually one. Can we name companies here? But that we know of in their human rights policy. But that's just a policy written on paper. We don't know how that will translate in reality. In the Philippines, there's now a bill passed to recognize human rights defenders, but still a bill. And when we look at the context in reality, there's massive red tagging of indigenous peoples and human rights defenders that's going on, and this we can see the same experiences in across Southeast Asia.
Right, thank you for that, Pachoy. So basically, we can't really have meaningful dialogue unless the groundwork is already there in terms of legislative changes, regulatory provisions, and so forth, right? In terms of free, prior, and informed consent. If that doesn't exist, then dialogue really will never really be on a level playing field with stakeholders.
I wouldn't say that the legislation has to be in place already. I think the states can take the lead even without the legislation. For example, in the Philippines, and this also, I guess, goes back to the level of understanding of government agencies. Not all government agencies understand the UNGPs the same way. For example, the national human rights institutions appreciate it more compared to, say, the Department of Finance, the economic managers of a country, because there's really that discord in terms of understanding. But if these government agencies have the initiative, even prior to having the legislation passed, then dialogues are possible. But of course, the ideal is to have the policy enacted.
Thanks for that. Kelly, what have been your experiences? What have you observed as good practices, if any?
So in addition to ongoing dialogue, I think of course increased capacity building and training is super important, especially when we engage with companies to help them to understand the guiding principles. And I think to give a practical example, when we work with them to conduct human rights impact assessments, for example, they think that this is an audit, right? So there is a general misunderstanding of what human rights due diligence actually means. And I think sometimes companies don't know who their rights holders are. So of course, getting them to understand who they're potentially impacting, who are their rights holders and stakeholders. And of course, going back to what you mentioned around intersectionality, I think it's important, we think it's important for them to understand who their rights holders are, but also what types of discrimination they might be facing based on their multiple identities. So we can't look at each group as monolithic. There are absolutely different types of intersections in terms of how people are vulnerable and marginalized. And even in the sort of methodology that we use in human rights impact assessments, who are your hidden groups? Who are the people who are not visible? Even people who are in in the informal sector, somewhere along down the supply chain, casual workers, migrant workers, contract and agency workers who are working on 0-hour contracts. they're often hidden in these types of exercises. So how can we get the guiding principles to reach those stakeholders? So I think that that is the biggest challenge for companies and also for us to ensure that we identify the right stakeholders, we engage them in dialogue, but also understand how they're being impacted negatively so that we can address it effectively.
Well, that is a really important point about identifying those hidden stakeholders who really oughtn't to be hidden, but that's the reality, isn't it? So Kunarilak, are you able to share examples of good experiences, good practices, but also in your own work in leading the National Action Plan, have you come across those hidden stakeholders that Kelly was speaking about just now?
I think for certainly the constructive dialogue is important, but the way we communicate UNGP or even the NAP must be tailored to match with the target group. Like for example, when we we also work with the university as well. So we try to develop the media in the form of the child-friendly communication. And for this to discuss with the business, we need a good example from the business sector to talk with them. In the past, I will share the challenge because in the past when we try to explain them about the UNGP in a more like academic way, like because we are not in the field of business, and I think that the business sector doesn't like it, don't like it. I mean, they prefer to listen from someone from the business sector, from a good example from the business sector. So we are now trying to include business sector to teach the business sector, like to have the role model to train the business sector and to translate UNGP in a very easy understanding version for the business sector as well. We received the support also from the UNDP to help develop the easy understanding version of the media and then raise awareness to the business sector. And for the civil society sector, we also need to explain in a very easy understanding way as well. So I think the most important is that we need to tailor the teaching or the material to match with the target group.
And that is indeed incredibly important, but also very challenging, because that means you actually have to know your target groups very well as well to be able to tell what is going to make sense to them, what is going to appeal to them. And also, I think earlier today there was mention about incentives and how we can incentivize different stakeholders to really take up the UNGPs. I remember one of my own experiences speaking to an infrastructure company operating in this region, where I was trying to get them to comment on the UN guiding principles. I was speaking to managers, I was speaking also to engineers, and what really struck me was in one particular conversation with an engineer, I was like, are you aware of the UN guiding principles? Their response was, I have no idea what those are, but you might want to go and contact our public relations team about it. To me, that is a great example, or perhaps a slightly worrying example, of how the UNGPs aren't really getting filtered down to the more operational levels within a business operation. At the same time, it also makes me wonder, what other examples are there out there of bad practice that we can actually learn from, that can tell us more of what we need to do. So Manja, if you don't mind, because you mentioned that it's very difficult to find kind of positive examples or good practice examples, are there any examples of egregious, bad practice when it comes to communicating or implementing the UNGPs that you've come across in your line of work?
Of course, I mean, I couldn't even start where which one should I should start with in relation to sharing egregious practices. But we have heard, for those who were here yesterday during the discussions, and also the discussions this morning, cases were shared that manifest or that show that there is a failure of implementation of UNGPs on the ground. Of course, it is undeniable that at the international level, the UNGPs have heavily influenced policies and discussions at the international level, especially at the United Nations. Examples of these are the revisions in the OECD guidelines. There are some guidelines in the UN FAO. Special rapporteurs and treaty bodies are often referring to the UNGPs in terms in relation to cases affecting human rights and business. Even intergovernmental regional organizations like the Organization of American States have passed resolutions in relation to the UNGPs and encouraging states to promote corporate social responsibilities. But then, as you've said, it does not filter on the ground. So on the ground, we continue to face corporate abuses. A very good example I would like to give as we speak now. The Isnag indigenous peoples of Apayao, Philippines, they are facing the impending construction of 2 mega dams along their river. And their territory is always recognized as the last frontier in the north of the Philippines for biodiversity. They submitted 3 community resolutions of no consent. These are resolutions saying that we do not want the dam to be constructed. And despite these 3 community resolutions, the free prior informed consent process was still completed by the government and the business despite the opposition of the communities. And it was certified to have been accomplished by both the business, the business proponent, the project proponent, and the government. So they are faced now with how to deal with this because there's already a government stamp that there's a free prior informed consent was already done despite these resolutions of no consent. So where does this put them at the moment? So it puts them at a very at an even more vulnerable situation where they have to engage courts, where they have to engage with so many other levels of bureaucracy to try to prevent the construction of a dam, of 2 mega dams that in the first place they did not want to be constructed. And that in the first place, they made clear their positions that they do not want to be constructed. So this is a very good example where community opposition is very clear, but the responsibility of the state in trying to protect, in protecting the rights of these indigenous peoples has totally failed.
Thank you for that, Manja, and I think your frustration is palpable, and understandably so. I also recall other engagements with civil society and communities affected by large infrastructure programs in Southeast Asia. I won't name the country, but I do recall one instance where community leaders had informed me that they had engaged in discussions with, the local government, with businesses, via an interpreter. And as it turned out, the interpretation was intentionally inaccurate, at least from their perspective, in terms of intentionally miscommunicating the amount of compensation, the scope of the project, and so on and so forth. So not exactly the same as what you were saying there, but certainly this explains why communities are so very frustrated when it comes to turning what's on paper into practice. Now, we have about, and please correct me if I'm wrong, about 30 minutes. Rather than go into the third question that I had prepared for my colleagues here, I wonder if we can actually turn to all of you, because this again is supposed to be a roundtable, and the intention is for you to have the opportunity to interact as much as possible with our esteemed speakers today. So how about I turn over to the floor to see who here has a question for our roundtable speakers. We might collect around 2 or 3 depending on the time, and then we'll go into the third question. But yes, I see one hand up, and also if you could please keep your question concise and a question, that would be much appreciated. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, the panelists and the plenary. Thanks for a good comment here. So my name is Sen Mustafa. I'm from Rao Wallenberg Institute based in Cambodia. So my question is to Kelly, because Kelly, you mentioned that there is a lack of common understanding among business on the UNGP. So I just want to learn more, like, is it exactly like their lack of understanding, or there are something else behind this lack of understanding? because just like Dr. Diva said this morning, we need to find like a pressing point to the company. So is it really their lack of understanding, or because they put the profits at the front, or they put the human right at the forefront? So what exactly there, and how can we really press to that point? Thank you.
Sir Kelly, before you take that question, I did see another hand up from in front there, so please go ahead.
Thank you very much for nice presentations. I think that when you talk about the understanding of business and human rights, we should first talk about the understanding of human rights. Human rights is a cross-cutting issues, and without talking about full understanding of human rights, is it possible to understand business and human rights? Because it is it is not a separate entity that the business and human rights are separated, and it is the cross-section or intersectionality of all human rights issues. And my question is that who is responsible to make understood about UNGPs? Government agencies, civil society, NHRIs, lawyer of the business company, or who else? Because most of the cases, lawyer of business community themselves is not aware about the human rights and UNGPs, and always lawyers are tried to defend human rights and try to escape from providing remedies. So I want to hear from the experts. Thank you.
All right, so we might start with those two questions first. I do note the hand up at the back, but Sir Kelly, please go ahead with the first question. And then I think for the second question about how to interpret human rights and who has the ability to interpret, we'll go to the three speakers here. So Kelly, please go ahead.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the gentleman for the great question. That's a really good one, because I can only speak for the member companies we work with, and it's absolutely a miscommunication and lack of understanding of the guiding principles, where I think that companies, especially multinational companies who we work with, can also use leverage to help to socialize companies within their operations on the guiding principles. There sometimes can be, lack of willingness to understand the guiding principles, but I think that there needs to be some pressure points, as you mentioned. I can give you a couple of examples, which might help to illustrate my point. We've worked with a multinational company, which I can't mention the name, and they had operations. They're based in Europe. They've had operations in parts of Asia. They had great, human rights policies in place, really good, suite of policies and codes of conduct. But there was a lack of communication between, the multinational and their operations. They're bearing the same name. And we found, in our interactions with these companies that they were unaware of the global policies. That's first and foremost. And secondly, they were not aware of the guiding principles. They were very much concerned about complying with national law. And I think that was their baseline. So I think it's down to lack of awareness and capacity building, which I think that multinationals can also fill that gap. They have a responsibility to share that information and also to build the capacity of their companies within their operations and sphere of influence. So I think that's a massive gap there. Can I give one more example? So I mean, we're seeing this a lot. We're seeing that there is definitely a miscommunication, I think, within the business community and their own subsidiaries, etc. But we've also seen, I might give a very good example as well to counterbalance this. We did work with a company in Europe as well. They wanted us to conduct, they worked with us to conduct a human rights impact assessment for a company in Malaysia. They wanted to form a business relationship with this company. The company in Malaysia had no idea about the guiding principles. They're family owned, they're not on the stock exchange. So therefore, where are the pressure points? But the company in Europe, for example, basically, we worked together to conduct the impact assessment, understanding some of the, baseline human rights concerns. And from there, they gained some understanding and awareness of the guiding principles of what due diligence looks like, what are some of the human rights risks on the ground. And from there on, we as BSR established a formal relationship with this company in Malaysia where they actually initiated further human rights impact assessments because of their willingness and desire to understand what human rights risks were on the ground for their employees and also suppliers. So I think that I just wanted to give that good example of how you can cascade information down in your supply chain, and where companies can actually take responsibility to help understanding of the guiding principles as well.
Great, and I really like that phrase, how to cascade down information in your supply chain. And I suppose that also resonates with the question that was asked about human rights. What do we understand by it? How can we communicate it effectively with a sense of common understanding, of course? So Pochoy, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And to answer who is responsible to communicate or interpret human rights, business and human rights, I would say everyone has a part: civil society, businesses, states, governments. But the primary duty bearer here, of course, falls on the state. They are the entities that are tasked to promote respect for human rights and the duty to protect human rights in their jurisdictions. And that falls on national human rights institutions, human rights commissions, and I would say in across agencies, even the economic managers that I was talking about earlier. And most states have ratified international covenants on human rights, the ICCPR, the ICESCR, and given the influence of businesses, their impact to human lives, and of course their the income that they generate, specifically transnational corporations, I think they're all, and according to the guiding principles, they have the responsibility to respect human rights, and along with that is the responsibility to promote human rights. So that also falls on them. And we all know civil society plays a part, and that's why we sort of fill the gaps when it comes to the promotion of human rights. So everyone, but mainly those two that affect the lives of people so much.
Thanks for that, Pochoy. So the primary duty bearer in all of this is the state. And I'm looking at you over there, Kunarilak. What would be your 2 cents on this?
So I agree with my colleague that actually every sector can help in building up the awareness on the UNGP, but the government can take leads can be a leader in kind of make sure that everyone is understanding on the UNGP, and also create some kind of activities to build up the knowledge, to increase the knowledge on UNGP. And of course, because government has a resource to support on the kind of activity in increasing the awareness as well. So I think I agree with my colleague that governments can take lead on making everyone in the same page in understanding the principle of the UNGP.
Right, Manja, your thoughts on this? What more can be done? What more needs to be done?
It's they have already actually said it. The primary responsibility lies on the state. Although unfortunately they fail also in this obligation to promote human rights on the ground, because they want to keep the people ignorant of their rights so that they can do whatever they want to do. So in reality, actually, promotion of human rights is done more by non-government organizations, non-government stakeholders, and this is necessary, and this is a way for them. Being aware and knowledgeable of their rights is their only weapon to confront state abuses, business abuses.
Thank you for that. Okay, so we have more hands up. I note that there was a gentleman at the back in blue. You had your hand up for a while. We're going to try and collect perhaps 2 more points, but over to you first.
Thank you, Dr. Pichamon. My name is Praveen. I belong to an indigenous group called Newars. We are the natives of Kathmandu Valley and surrounding areas. And we have been facing multiple human rights challenges in the name of haphazard urbanization and infrastructure development projects in our lands. But while without going into that, I would come to the subject matter of the session. And particularly, I have two observations to make, and then I would ask our expert panelists, particularly from the business and the government sector, to comment on it. First observation, I think, for translating the UNGPs into real change, given the context of Nepal and other Asian states, I don't think weak naps can be the answer to translating UNGPs into real change in the context of Asian states. Countries like Nepal and states in Asia do not comply even with the laws that are existing, so voluntary measures, I don't think, can be the answers. They don't comply with the international human rights obligations, and even the recommendations from the UN bodies like CERD, CEDAW, even when those recommendations are very explicit. So what we need, I think, in the context of countries like Nepal and other Asian states, is more push towards mandatory measures, legal reforms to guarantee our rights, and legal reforms to oblige companies to undertake mandatory human rights due diligence. There is already some steps towards that in European states, and I think Asian states should immediately follow. Taking the example of Nepal itself, Nepal has ratified ILO Convention 169, Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, for more than a decade now. And National Action Plan for to translate that convention into national law has been stuck in the cabinet for almost about the same time. So another nap, I don't think, is an answer for Nepal or any other Asian state. With legal reforms, I think the second biggest challenge,
sorry,
I'll keep it one just minute. With legal reforms, the other biggest challenge is going to be the access to remedy. We already see a lot of violations happening. So just communication, dialogues is not the answer for translating UNGPs on the ground anymore. We need real justice, access to justice. And what we see is there are mechanisms on the in countries, but those mechanisms have failed. NHRIs in Nepal, NHRC in Nepal don't take complaints on cases that are sub judice in court, and courts take decades to make a decision on a petition about human rights violations. And so in the context of such failure of national human rights mechanisms, when we leverage international mechanisms such as investor mechanisms of multilateral development banks, those banks also take years to investigate, while the construction of these infrastructure projects or business projects continue, and there are further harms. So how do we improve these access to the remedy mechanisms is another big question. No, I have the key question. I'm just putting a key question. The key question that I asked, again, the business sector and the government representative in the panel is: do you think there is willingness among the businesses and governments in Asia for mandatory human rights due diligence and reforms in remedy mechanisms, so that there is real change on the ground? Thank you.
Sure, thanks for that. Look, I think I did see a lot of hands up just now. If you could please try and keep your interventions as concise as possible so that we have a chance to respond. And then we can, of course, talk about these issues more outside as well. So I noted that you had your hand up for a while. Please go ahead.
All of you on the panel have talked about communication and a sort of discrepancy between what's written on paper and how it's understood either in the ground or in businesses. So the question of awareness. My name is Jake from the Conscious Advertising Network. So my question is are there any targets within the UNGPs or within the construction of the agreements on awareness measures, either within business or within the population? Because if everybody in business and in the population understood the UNGPs together, then there would be shared language. So if you actually put targets of 80% of the population needs to understand these, for example, then that would make the interpretation, I guess, easier.
Sure, thanks for that. We might just collect one more. So can I please get a show of hands? Okay, over there, so go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I heard a lot of questions regarding how we can make sure that local communities and marginalized communities can know about the UNGPs. So I would like to share with you the experience that we had in Thailand. Since 2017, so sorry, I'm the founder and executive director of Manushaya Foundation. My name is Emily Palami Praditit, and I'm here with members of the Thai BH Short Network. Since 2017, we have been working on a national baseline assessment to inform the first ever national action plan on business and human rights in Asia. The Thai government has been championed in this region as the best country in Asia for having a national action plan. We did all the work, we did all the capacity building as civil society to train communities, indigenous people, environmental defenders, land rights defenders to know about the UNGPs. For the past 5 years, we have been training them and they knew all of it. Indigenous people, environmental defenders have had a lot of meetings with the government. At the end of the day, through meaningful engagement, we have been used in the process. UNDP has been supporting the Thai government, championing it at championing it at the best country in Asia, producing videos, and shaping a false narrative. The UNGPs are not working through NAPs. It did not work in Thailand. At the end of the day, we had very weak NAPs, only voluntary measures. In the past 8 years, we have 450 women human rights defenders that have been slapped, who are facing judicial harassment. Since we have an app with 0 anti-slap measures in it, with 0 mandatory measures in it, only voluntary measures, human rights defenders, the situation of human rights defenders has worsened. It's time for Thailand, it's time for businesses to put people and planet over profit, because enough is enough. And the only way that we can implement the UNGPs effectively is through mandatory human rights due diligence, responsibility of companies, civil responsibility of companies to be held accountable, to provide fair and effective remedy and compensation to communities, because enough is enough. We also want Asian states to engage through the binding treaty on business and human rights. The NAPs alone are not enough. It's time to stop napping. We want people and planet over profit. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for those comments and question. I think we might actually not have enough time to go to the other people who had raised their hands, given that the questions asked and the comments made are actually quite big. So how about we take the question asked about awareness measures and how we can actually, are there targets? Should we be setting targets? And then on to the bigger question about access to remedy and perhaps about addressing the issue that was made just now about enough is enough. So Kelly, I feel like you might have something to say about the awareness measures when it comes to the UNGPs.
Yeah, that was a good question. I think awareness is one thing and communication is one thing, but action is definitely another. So I guess, working with companies to ensure that they're taking action. I mean, we make recommendations for, what good practice looks like, what they should do to improve the lives of their workers in their operations and their supply chains. And they need to act, of course. So communication helps, obviously, with understanding what the expectations are of the guiding principles. And also, I think, let's go back to the original point about local context and ensuring that they are applicable in the local context, because I think that that's a massive barrier. But also understanding what the challenges are. None of this is easy. In my mind, I feel that this is simple, respect human rights. But at the same time, I feel that action is something that might be missing. Communication is great, and I think that that's needed so that the expectations are well understood, but they also need to be practical. And I think that we need to look at the barriers to action, which can help us to understand how to move forward.
Thank you for that, Kelly. Did anyone else want to weigh in on that particular question about, how do we raise awareness? Should we be setting awareness measures, targets? Anyone? Okay. In that case, was that a hand up?
No, I was going to say that it could be addressed to the working group as well.
That could be addressed to the working group. Thank you for pointing that out, Pochoy. No, it is indeed a very good question, and I think we certainly need to understand more how advertising can also come into play in all of this, and it is really that bigger question about communication. Now, speaking of communication, I appreciate what was said by our colleague from Nepal, if I'm not mistaken, as well as from colleagues here from Thailand. I also note that there are hands hands raised. I am not sure that we have the time, unfortunately. But what I would like to say, though, is let's open this up and let's be constructive to see whether or not, what can we say about the bigger issue to do with access to remedy, but also, how can we make these naps not napping, but really to take them up to the next level. So I see you nodding your head, Puchoy. Would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, just wanted to weigh in on access to remedy. I think that's why there's a lot of interest with mandatory human rights due diligence and the legally binding treaty, because that will allow a legal codification or recognition of extraterritorial obligations of states. And in the case of TNCs can be sued by affected communities in their home state instead of being sued at the host state, which oftentimes has a very weak judicial system. I think our friend from Nepal mentioned that the court cases have been going on for years. That's a similar experience we have in the Philippines. For example, in the recent decision on the Mar Copper spill, it took 20 years to get damages awarded to the complainants, to the victims of this massive mine spill. And they were 60 at the start. Most of them have died already. Only around 30 people actually received compensation for the damages that were brought to them. So yeah, that's why I think it's important to have mandatory mechanisms like mandatory human rights due diligence that allows access to courts of the home state of the TNC, and yes, also interest on the LBI because it allows for that access.
Thank you for that, Puchoy. Manja, would you like to share your thoughts on those two, I suppose, big themes rather than questions?
You mentioned earlier, Pichamon, that maybe we'll taking this on to the next stage. So I take off from that statement and in promoting or rallying for support in the current process to elaborate a legally binding instrument to regulate transnational corporations and other business enterprises under international human rights law. So the United Nations is currently drafting a treaty to regulate transnational corporations, and there has been minimal participation or support from the states in Asia. I think taking this on forward would mean going from these voluntary guidelines towards a more binding to instrument. And this is the process. So it would be very important for Asia, especially us in the global south, to protect our territories, to protect our biodiversity, to protect our environment from total destruction. We have to participate in this process. We have to support this process. And we have to know about this process to ensure that human rights and the people and the environment are at the center of the negotiations.
Great, thank you for that, Manja. And so on to you, Kunarilak.
So I will respond to comments and related to Thailand. In terms of, I understand that now everyone wants the kind of the mandatory measures or the legally binding instruments, but I think at least NAP is a good start for each government, and also it can lead and also lead to the many development as well. Even in Thailand, for example, since we have NAP like 4 years ago, we have quite a lot of many development in Thailand, as you can see from the evaluation process of the NAP, and is also accessible in the website. If we don't have NAP at the 4 years ago, maybe lots of development may not happen in Thailand. And I think at least NAP is a good start, but mandatory measure is also important, and it can be the goal at the end. Maybe we can move from national action plan to the legally binding instrument later. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So we now have just about 5 minutes left, and I do acknowledge the fact that I started late. I also note that there is one person sitting in front who seems desperately wanting to ask a question. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to provide you with about 30 seconds to provide your question. 30 seconds because we really need to conclude. And then I also have a final burning question for the panel with respect to the next decade of the UNGPs. But if you can please keep your question as short as possible.
So I will speak in Thai instead, then it's my mother language here. อยากจะให้นะคะตอนนี้เราไม่ใช่ว่าไม่เคยพยายามในการช่วยสื่อสารเรื่อง NAP ในประเทศไทยนาดามั่นใจว่าเป็นคนหนึ่งที่สื่อสารเรื่อง NAP เชิงบวกมาตลอดในการทำเคสเรื่องการเลือกปฏิบัติและการกีดกันคนข้ามเพศผู้หญิงและคนที่มีความหลากหลายทางเพศอื่นๆในโลกของการทำงานรวมถึงการคุกคามทางเพศในโลกของการทำงานนาดาเอา NAP ใส่เข้าไปด้วยเสมอแม้ว่า NAP จะมีช่องว่างอย่างมหาศาลก็คือบริบทบอกว่ามีปัญหาแต่พอพูดเรื่อง action plan กับไม่มีใส่เลยทีนี้มันทำให้เราต้องเจอสุดท้ายเราช่วยเคสเราเจอฟ้องพอเราเจอฟ้องล่าสุดเมื่ออาทิตย์ที่แล้วอะค่ะจะให้เราอยู่เฉยแล้วมองว่าแนปมันสวยหรูเป็นไปไม่ได้นี่เขาบอกขนาดเป็นเรื่อง LGBT ถูกมองว่าเป็นเรื่อง soft power นะเป็นเรื่องใสๆรัฐบาลไม่คิดว่ามันจะกระทบกระเทือนอะไรเลยเรายังโดนฟ้องมันต้องพูดถึงเรื่องนี่คุณเพรมศินีโดนฟ้องเป็น10 คดีสู้มา13 ปีเรื่องเหมืองทองคำค่ะสิ่งที่รัฐบาลต้องทำมันไม่ใช่แค่จุดเริ่มต้นgood start ไม่พอเราโดนฟ้องเราโดนดำเนินคดีแล้วค่าใช้จ่ายในการดำเนินคดีสุขภาพกายใจสังคมของเราค่ะได้รับผลกระทบกระเทือนอย่างมหาศาลมากจนนาดาไม่เชื่ออีกแล้วว่าจะเหลือกระบวนการยุติธรรมอะไรให้เราพึ่งพาได้เพราะฉะนั้นเนี่ยรัฐบาลต้องออกมาตรการอะไรก็ตามที่มันมีผลในเชิงการ intervention แล้วเพราะเราถูกฟ้องคดีไม่หยุดคุณแม่มาปกป้องแผ่นดินถิ่นเกิดโดนฟ้องคดีทำไมท่านผู้เชี่ยวชาญต้องพูดถึงเรื่อง intersectionality ผู้หญิงคนหนึ่งโดนฟ้องคดีใครบ้างลูกหลานเหลนโหลนที่บ้านนาดาพ่อแม่อีกเพราะฉะนั้นการเป็นนักปกป้องสิทธิ์เนี่ยมันหนักสาหัสสำหรับเราอยู่แล้วค่ะมันมากกว่า30 วินาทีที่เราจะต้องพูดเรื่องนี้ให้ฟังแต่เราต้องการแอคชั่นที่มันจริงจังค่ะเราไม่ต้องการให้นายรัฐมนตรีมาเดินจับมือถือแขนกับใครไม่รู้ที่นี่แล้วก็บอกว่าเราจะเป็นแชมเปี้ยนในขณะที่พวกเรากำลังแบกรับความทุกข์ทรมานแสนสาหัสจากการปกป้องแผ่นดินถิ่นเกิดปกป้องสิทธิมนุษยชนที่ติดตัวเรามาแต่กำเนิดขอบคุณค่ะ
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, and also for bringing us back to the question of intersectionality. Again, unfortunately, we can't accommodate all of the questions and comments, but I'm sure the speakers here today would be more than happy to engage you further. So in the interest of time and noticing that we are, in fact, at time, but that I did arrive a bit late, apologies again for that, I just wondered if the speakers could please provide us with perhaps a couple of sentences, pearls of wisdom, in terms of what we should be bearing in mind as we look forward to the next decade of the UNGPs. What can we do better? How can the language be improved? How can we make it more intersectional? So Kelly, if you don't mind, thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your insights as well from the floor. Just to say, this is from my personal view. I do feel that we need to keep rights holders at the center of everything that we do, everything that we aim to achieve. And I completely agree with putting people before profit. That's my personal stance. So I do appreciate when rights holders, vulnerable groups, persons who are marginalized, anyone, all stakeholders have a platform to speak up and say how they feel, because this is what businesses need to hear. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kelly. Puchoy.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to thank all the speakers for their input as well. Pichomon for moderating, and also the inputs from the floor. And I guess it's a good reminder to know that all of these business and human rights frameworks at the center is really the affected communities, the victims of business-related human rights violations. That's why we have these frameworks. And so we have to listen As a member of the resource center, our function is really to empower the voices that are not heard enough, and we need to listen to the voices from the ground and take into account what they're saying in order to have these policies that are effective and are legitimate. And I think one theme that we can not ignore in this forum is really the push for an evolution, a progress from voluntary measures. We hear these comments all the time that voluntary measures are not enough, and so we have to progress from voluntary to mandatory mechanisms.
Great, thank you, Buchoy. Kun Narilak, please go ahead.
ค่ะ. For me, I thank hello.ค่ะ. For me, I thank you very much for all the comments, and I think for the next decade of the UNGP, I think the political commitments, the good collaboration from all stake sectors, and also constructive engagement and constructive dialogue they are all important to pave the way to success. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And last but not least, Manja.
Thank you for that. I think there's no problem with the language of the UNGP. But after 10 years, and we have done this stock taking and all, as we've said earlier, it's time to move on to the next stage. Translating policy into performance. This has been elaborated with many interventions earlier. And then supporting a more legally binding instrument, not just voluntary guiding principles. And one important thing that I would like to add to that is supporting and promoting good practices. Because we also have to recognize that some states have done their best or have done good practices in implementing the UNGPs. Not everyone or everything is failing. Let us use these good practices to show to other states that it is actually good for them if they implement the UNGPs. And it's actually good for business if human rights are respected. I would like to live to see the day where the UNGPs are actually irrelevant in the world, because people are living peacefully and harmoniously in communities thriving in biodiversity and rich in natural resources, and where state forces are fighting aliens instead of their own people. Well, you may say I am a dreamer, but as John Lennon said, I am not the only one. So to us dreamers around there, let us keep the fire burning.
Indeed, let us keep the fire burning. Let us hope for the day when the UNGPs become unnecessary. And on that note, please join me in thanking again our speakers, thank all of you for joining us today, and also, of course, thank you to the interpreters upstairs as well.